Okay, so welcome everybody to the panel discussion at MLCN 2021. We're very fortunate to have fantastic panelists today. I wanted to start by giving a brief overview of machine learning in neuroimaging, because you've seen, I'm not alone in noticing this, that it's absolutely everywhere. What I mean by that is it's everywhere in the processing chain. So even for designing sequences, for creating new pulse sequences, new RF pulses, you do have now more and more machine learning and deep learning. For reconstruction, all the stuff that happens before you get an image, you had recently the challenge, the Fast MRI Challenge, 2019-2020. That showed a lot of advances in the field. And of course, where most of us live in post-processing, that is in segmentation and this kind of application. So it's absolutely everywhere. Some of it is hidden in hospitals, and hospitals are using it without even knowing. It's not only in a processing chain, it's also essentially whatever type of algorithm you're doing, things that we used to do differently maybe 10 or 20 years ago, now you do with machine learning and specifically deep learning. That can be segmentation, abnormality detection, classification, of course, clustering, registration. And there's a lot of interesting things happening in dimensionality reduction with autoencoders and the like. So it's not only along the processing chain, but also in algorithms. And of course, all of this would be useless in a clinical setting if we didn't have clinical applications, but we do. Typically, differential diagnosis now is getting more and more common. So it's getting not just disease versus control, but which subtype of the disease. We had several talks about this issue, and this is an issue. This is an area where machine learning can help, I believe, tremendously. Intervention eligibility is another one where I think we are starting to see nice applications using deep learning. Drug eligibility, just very recently, now you have this Aduhelm drug for Alzheimer's that's been approved. It relies on excluding amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. This is exactly the kind of things that you could do with deep learning. Also for follow-up of drug effects. For treatment selection, also is something, especially I believe in neuropsychiatry, where we will see more and more of these. And of course, prognosis and survival modeling. So all of these techniques are spilling over from cancer and coming into brain imaging. So we have, if you want, the golden triangle here of data, methods, and clinical use. And this, I believe, is a good frame for what we will discuss during this panel discussion. So the questions and the topics for discussion will center basically around this: neuroimaging problems and machine learning solutions, so the interplay between the different communities of researchers; neuroimaging plus X, so omics, genomics, proteomics, etc., for clinical applications; the clinical utility of machine learning for neuroimaging, because of course we need to show the value of these methods, which also goes with robustness and trust. How can we trust these methods, and are they robust to variability? And at the center of all of this, of course, open neuroimaging data and its impact. We couldn't do anything without data. So this is the framing for the discussion. For those of you in the audience, you are extremely welcome to ask questions if you'd like, to propose topics. I'm looking at the chat right now, so please don't hesitate to intervene and propose topics for discussion. We have about 45 minutes for this discussion. And we're very fortunate to have a fantastic panel today. So you've already met, those of you that have been here throughout the day, Adrian Dalker, who's assistant professor at Martinos and MGH, and also research scientist at CSL MIT. His work focuses mainly, as you've seen, on registration and segmentation, including the Learn to Reg challenge, deep learning for registration, voxel morph that we've seen before. We also have Christos Davatzikos, who's a Wallace T. Miller Senior Professor of Radiology, Electrical and Systems Engineering, also Director of the Center for Biomedical Image Computing and Analytics, and Director of the Artificial Intelligence in Biomedical Imaging Lab. So his work focuses on imaging biomarkers for disease, mostly Alzheimer's, but also glioma and schizophrenia. He also did a lot of work with classical machine learning models on multivariate statistical analysis of imaging data, what used to be called brain decoding, or MVPA in some communities, and of course some recent work on harmonization with combat plus GAN. We have Paul Thompson, whom you've seen before at the keynote, from the University of Southern California. He's a professor of neurology, radiology, and engineering, among other fields. I'm shortening a bit here. A director, of course, of the Enigma Consortium and the Enigma Center for Worldwide Medicine, Imaging, and Genomics, director of the USC Imaging Genetics Center, and associate director of the Mark and Mary Stevens Neuroimaging and Informatics Institute. You probably know Paul from his work on Enigma, on imaging genetics, and that has gone from essentially voxel-wise GWAS to federated analysis, partial list squares, and all sorts of modern methods for this kind of analysis. Paul has worked a lot on brain structure in normal development and disease, and of course, a strong focus of his work is on clinical AD, including participating in ADNI, clinical use of MRI and atrophy in ADNI, but also schizophrenia. And finally, we have also Emma Robinson from King's College London, who's a lecturer in medical image analysis at the Department of Biomedical Engineering. You probably know her work on multimodal surface matching with cortical surface registration, who's basically been instrumental in the Human Connectome project. She has done a lot of work on developmental neuroscience and the developmental part of the HCP project, and more recently some interesting work on interpretability, including the ICAM method. So these are our panelists. And what I would like to do is to maybe get a bit of historical perspective, because all our panelists have a long-standing experience in machine learning. So if you think about this image processing chain that we discussed before, where along this image processing chain do you think that machine learning has already had the biggest impact? So things maybe we don't realize, but you think this has moved the field tremendously along the line. So maybe Adrian, if you'd like to start with this one, I can guess where you're going to go, but that would be good to have your input on that.
I don't know that it'd be good to have my input. I have my own preferences of what I'd like to do, but I don't have a good understanding of the complete pipeline. So it'd be hard to say. I think we can have incredible impact with registration, but I'd actually love to hear from maybe people who have a broader view of the entire pipeline, because I think every time I meet a clinical collaborator, I realize there's an entire part of the pipeline I don't understand. So I'm curious to see what people who have a broader view can say.
Christos, would you like to put this into the context maybe of a radiology department?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is a great question. I think fundamentally segmentation is a problem that is closer to, to becoming widely adopted. And, it fits very well with both clinicians, in particular radiologists, and companies who have now collected thousands of data sets like Siemens and others, who can train a segmentation model and have it basically accelerate or reduce the amount of time the radiologist spends on defining the structures. And I think this is a very well-defined problem. Easy accessibility, or relatively not easy, but relatively accessible data sets for training. People can train their own models. And so I think this is an area where, it's the lowest hanging fruit that I see. I was going to contrast it with things that are further down the road, but maybe I'll let others go and you will come back to that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So Emma, do you feel that segmentation in general, maybe if we extend a little bit to morphology or morphometric analysis, maybe, but do you feel that this is where already you can measure the impact, maybe in terms of not only fundamental understanding of the brain, but more towards clinical applications?
Well, I think that segmentation is the most well developed because it's an area of machine learning that has been paralleled in the natural imaging domain. So it came straight out there and it's been the most researched. But I think, things like image registration, image reconstruction are where the biomedical imaging community started to take machine learning into their own and have a really large impact. I think segmentation is clearly the area where it's still having the biggest impact, and is probably the one that's is going to be entering the clinical domain first, because you've got companies like DeepMind investing Google investing huge amounts of money just in breast cancer classification and segmentation and making sure that it really generalizes. But in terms of like where we'd like to take it, in an ideal world, I think, what I'd like to be able to do is sort of have end-to-end sort of real-time clinical diagnostics. So perhaps even explainable ML from like the Fourier domain or shortly after. So I think there's opportunity there. We've already started to see it with registration and reconstruction to really make it our own and go and do really new and game-changing things with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Paul, what's your take then on segmentation? Because you've seen, this probably you've seen the stark contrast between doing things by hand and now these methods that work pretty well. So what do you think for Alzheimer's disease, for example?
I agree, Jonas, and I agree with all the other speakers. I mean, it's just such an exciting time. I feel like we can categorize the problems into ones that we can do pretty well now, but deep learning and machine learning will improve them, and ones that we just simply cannot do now at all. And within those boxes, there's even more categories. So one of the journals I like reading, it's an AI in radiology journal, and they're just every week, I mean, you'll see this, doing things that we never dreamed of before, adding GAD contrast to images, using paired deep learning without having to put the GAD in, improving the images themselves. I mean, you mentioned fast MRI and deep DTI, which is another area. So number one, I think the generation of images in ingenious new ways seems to be a really big area of growth. And I mean, it goes back to what Emma and Adrian and Christos were saying. If we can make the actual image better, every downstream task is likely to benefit. I mean, if the contrast or resolution or SNR for detecting different things, and that could even be post-processing. So let's say a drug trial wants to eliminate or reduce amyloid accumulation, but we want to, I mean, you mentioned this, Jonas, in your intro, we want to decide if someone has an amyloid positive brain without PET. I mean, maybe MR, maybe diffusion, maybe the combination of everything can be a quick test of whether they can then go on to a more invasive, CSF or PET-based amyloid scan. So my own prejudice is that the earlier in the processing stream the innovation happens, I mean, like getting a better telescope, all the later subsequent tasks become a little bit easier. And I mean, I think Adrian mentioned Melba and some other journals. I'm just seeing new journals coming in with just fantastic, image synthesis and image generation capabilities that seem like they amplify all the way downstream to big knock-on effects.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, actually. So yeah, you gain probably the most if you can do this earlier, but also in terms of timing. I think for clinical timings, radiologists, my colleagues are very sensitive to timing, and they basically want fast things. So let maybe because of this, it's maybe because of this point that you made, that the generation of images is probably where most of the where most benefit has accrued. Let me move it a bit into the future. And this is a question I really like to ask, and that I still don't have a clear answer to this. Like, should we really generate images? And that also goes towards Emma's point about moving towards diagnosis in the end. But should we really optimize images for humans? Like, should we not? Because now we have all these fancy reconstruction. If the goal is diagnosis in the end, like is a human readable image really a must? Or should we just skip that and just like generate something that has some statistical properties that make it easier to diagnose? Basically, just generate some latent space, and we don't even need to see a brain. Straight from K-space to latent something, and then the machine maybe works better. What do you think, Adrian?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I'm of two minds. My younger self, I mean, my PhD student self, I would say that sounds like a very exciting direction, and I'd love to see it. And in fact, we have some projects that are kind of in that direction. How do we determine what to scan if image quality isn't the goal, overall image quality isn't the goal? But I think the biggest challenge is, of course, one of working with the radiologists and clinicians, right? Or diagnosticians or whoever is going to use this data or the insurance companies and figuring out how that sort of work can be practical. So I think it's a balance. I think it's really exciting technically, but I don't know, it's an incredible effort to get those sort of technologies to be trusted. So it's sort of one of these things that's going to have to move slowly and gain trust, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're touching also, like you're touched on several things which I think are particularly important. We'll definitely come back. You mentioned insurance, which is, I think, a very, very underexplored area. We don't like this, who's paying for things in the academic world, but in the end, if you want the innovation to work, you need somebody to pay for these algorithms at some point. So maybe we'll come back to that. You also mentioned this notion of trust. So maybe let's talk a little bit about that. I think this is actually something that all of you have seen with a large data set. So Paul, definitely with the Enigma collection, you've seen this data from all over the world, and likewise, Christos, with your work on harmonization. I'm thinking of Combat plus GAM, and Emma, I'm sure you've seen also the HCP is kind of a nice machine, but what do you do if you move to other machines? So maybe this is one. I'd like to hear your take a bit on this one, Christos. The question is, you have an algorithm that works well, and you've shown maybe on one data set, maybe on two data sets, but now how can I trust that this algorithm will work on my data? Because I care, not about necessarily your paper in your population, because maybe my population is very different, but even not the population, maybe my scanner is different. Classical difference, Switzerland is very Siemens and Philips centric. US is very GE centric if we're talking about MR. So how do we deal with that? And do you think that ultimately we can have some software that makes these acquisitions hardware independent, and then we can really trust that this will work everywhere?
Yeah, I think that this is a great question. I think most of us face it every day, both theoretically and practically. But I think we will see it has a lot of solutions in parallel directions. The one is you need large training, and in my experience is not the large. The emphasis is not on the large, but on the diverse, as you can imagine. And I think Adrian showed some data that you really don't need very large N, but you do need diversity. So I think we're going to see, as these large databases, you saw Paul's Enigma stuff, of course, which is everybody knows, and a number of other initiatives that are emerging. I think they're going to offer opportunities for very broad-based training and models that have seen the diversity. And I was very intrigued by what Adrian showed. This is amazing stuff with synthesizing these variations. It's essentially smart data augmentation, which is, I think, great, and we're going to see a lot of it. Now, the second area is domain shift, and we have a lot to borrow from computer vision and machine learning folks. They worry about these things. When they design smart cars, your car should not work only under rainy conditions. It should work under sunny and snowy conditions and other things. So they worry about these things, and there's certainly a lot of technologies that are coming out. I think we're going to see a lot of this, but some of it is actually simple things that we researchers tend to focus on the sophisticated and challenging formulations that will solve a problem. Some things are very easy to solve, like and it's what I call calibration. You have a model that has been derived, and you just sometimes need to calibrate that model to your own local environment. It's not a big deal. It's not that you have to retrain a big thing or whatever. It might be a shift in the decision functions or the estimates that it provides that it needs to be calibrated very easily by a shift in the scale. So some of these things that I think more practitioners will end up doing, because many of us were interested in the sophisticated methodologies, are not very keen on doing these things. So I think some solutions are easy. So I think we're going to see a little bit of all of these.
Okay, thank you very much. Paul, would you mind to illuminate a little bit this discussion with the example of Enigma, which has data from I don't know how many sites? What's the solution here, or at least an approach to deal with this domain shift issue?
Yeah, I know what you mean, Jonas. So I agree with Christos. So domain shift, and you all know there's another MICI workshop, DARTS, domain shift and representation learning. And I'd love that workshop. I mean, it's right on the money of the question that you're asking. And often domain shift can be broken down into different situations. So, I mean, maybe the scanner changed, maybe the protocol changed, and, a different source of domain shift is maybe the population changed. And did the population change a bit, or is it completely disjoint? And I was at a talk the other day on algorithmic fairness, where they came up with the following thought experiment. They said, suppose in the training population, the following relationships hold with the outcome. But then in a new one you haven't seen, all the predictors go the opposite way. So those of you familiar with adversarial attack and machine learning will know about these. You actually can make adversaries that have predictors go the opposite way. And the question then is, I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, do you throw away the original model and just train afresh? Do you do some smart transfer learning where you freeze some things, or maybe there's a latent space that is partially relevant, or do you do something else? And Mohammed also had a cool question in the chat about interaction. So sometimes things are kind of going the same way. I mean, a predictor is somewhat valuable in the new cohort, but it might interact with something that you need to measure as well. So, I mean, maybe, a patient has vascular disease and there might be a better treatment than the one the algorithm is saying for the amyloid or tau accumulation. So I feel like the short answer is, and I mean, you guys are doing a great job, I think, with this workshop and the DART one as well, is for us to try and learn and help others learn the situations where different domain adaptations make sense. So maybe a GAN makes sense. Maybe combat is fine. Maybe something in that set of methods doesn't work because the domain has shifted so much. I think, like Christos's example, if a self-driving car was only trained not in the snow, it would just be very confused. So I think this community can sort of make a taxonomy of the use cases and situations where different domain shift tactics are sensible to use. And there's a lot of confusion in this field. I mean, when you talk to your colleagues, they're not always sure what GANs do or what confounds. I mean, some of the papers we reviewed have confounds that are very pernicious in machine learning. So I feel like together we can sort of learn this and try and learn from each other a little bit about the kind of, let's say the best diagnosis of domain shift and what to do.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And you mentioned actually this interaction with other communities like radiologists and also the other workshops. And I think that's actually a point that I'd like to discuss a little bit, if that's okay. Specifically, the Christos also mentioned self-driving cars and learning from computer vision. So this one thing I'm interested in talking to you about is exactly this. Like, how does the innovation flow between the different communities, right? You have the hardcore, if you want, like machine learning communities like iClear, CVPR, CML, NeurIPS, etc. And then the more kind of imaging applied, MICI, ISB, middle, IPMI, etc. So what's your experience on the flow of problems and solutions? So you have problems looking for solutions in our case, or solutions looking for problems, maybe in some theoretical machine learning. So Emma, I know that you've done some work published, I believe, in NeurIPS as well, especially your interpretability work. Could you talk a little bit about this interplay between the machine learning community and the more the biomedical imaging community, if you will?
Okay, so well, historically, I think that we take a lot of inspiration from the machine learning and computer vision community, as we've said already. And yeah, so what our experience was with publishing in NeurIPS is it's quite hard in some sense to get biomedical imaging work in there, because for them to appreciate how difficult it is to switch from the natural image domain to medical imaging. It's, you can't be data agnostic. You have to, you're solving very specific problems. So we did experience that a bit. But I'm quite positive on that experience in general. I think trying to speak directly with people from that community to take those ideas directly from them. But yeah, I guess that's sorry, I'm just joking.
because I have the feeling that it's. I mean, not to say that ImageNet is easy or anything, right? I mean, it's but in a sense, like cats and dogs, 2D is slightly easier than cardiovascular imaging with 5D or even fMRI with 4D. So that's across multiple sites. I have this impression that there's a way to motivate machine learning people to even maybe more theoretical. I think there's a lot of problem with the non-isotropic noise, spatiotemporally varying noise that are not there in ImageNet, for example. So Adrian, you have a foot in both worlds, I believe, right? You're still affiliated with the CSAIL lab. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And maybe Paulina is a very good example, actually, of people that are doing fantastic things at the intersection as well.
I mean, I think I agree with them. I think there's an incredible sort of opportunity to learn across the domains. In some ways, it makes it a little bit easier than if you don't, because it's sort of like a multiplicative effect of ideas. And if you're careful, there's always ideas in the machine learning world that are unexplored along some dimensions because they just don't have the right data or questions, right? And we do, or we have the interesting questions. And in some ways we can explore some of those methodologies in interesting directions. I think, registration's one example where they deal a lot with optical flow, and registration is very similar, but it has its own constraints and its own inspirations from radiology. So I think it's a great place to work. I also think the students come with very, very different mentality, which is awesome, because again, it's an opportunity to sort of combine them. So I think I can easily summarize the whole thing by saying that being between two fields can be really, really great. Of course, that's excluding things like politics and so on and the complications of making that work.
I mean, one difficulty still is that for promotions, still, I mean, this is a small issue.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, they don't care about the conference papers. It can be NeurIPS, it can be the best conferences. It counts for 0 in your bibliometry. So this is slightly annoying. I don't know.
If I may, I can comment on that a little bit. And that when I started my position, I had a substantial push for the university and hospital to recognize that. And it was incredible how, I would say it was successful mostly because important people pushed for it. And now a NeurIPS publication is recognized as a publication, but it's incredible the stuff that mattered, which was things like make sure when you write the citation or like the citation on the CV, you mention the page numbers, because if they just see that it's a 12-page paper, they will know it's not a conference paper. And so that was remarkable to me that was what mattered. But it's again an issue of talking across worlds, right? There's probably things that they value substantially that we don't know where to pick up from as sort of the more technical folks. So yeah, I would say with effort, you can get past this as well, but I'll see if this isn't true anymore in a few years.
No, I agree. No, yeah, page numbers that matter. Yeah, because they call them abstracts actually. So they have abstracts that are not peer-reviewed. So even though it's a lot of effort. So so this is the world between biomedical imaging and maybe machine learning. But there's another world, of course, is between this biomedical imaging and the radiologists. And I think Christos, you're right in the middle of that. And that to me is another interface. Basically, I think there's a number of interfaces we need to cross to be successful in this space, like the machine learning, the theory, to the biomedical imaging, to the radiologists, which are some of the end users we need to convince with our algorithms. So one question we're posing here, like in Lausanne University Hospital, I'm sure you have this as well. Like how much machine learning do radiologists and neurologists need to know? And this is, because we mentioned before, like it's a GAN. Okay, what does it do? So how much, is there a role for medical education? Should they have credits for this? Should it be required for board certification? What is your feeling, Christos, on how these technologies actually go into real clinical use?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a great question. I guess I'm thinking out loud now, but I have two answers. The first one is that radiologists are absolutely crazy for AI in the past few years. I don't know if you've been to RSNA. It's become an AI meeting. It's just unbelievable. They all, they all run, TensorFlow and other things. Radiologists get hands-on experience, and they run their models. I mean, there's no doubt that. I mean, I've been in radiology for decades, and I've been trying to convince people for a long, long time, and all of a sudden, within a few years, they all switch and they all want to do AI and deep learning. So we no longer have the obstacle, the challenge of convincing at least radiologists, and I think neurologists, psychiatrists as well. That brings me to the second aspect of my answer, which is what exactly are we trying to achieve? And as you said, I think most people view it that way, is that the radiologists are the people we want to convince, the people who want to get our tools in the hands of, and so forth. And I actually had this discussion this morning with my former mentor, Nick Bryan, who was also the president of RSNA in the past. He's a very famous radiologist. And, his idea, like most radiologists' idea, is that our tools will have to be good enough, fast enough, whatever, to make it into their clinical routine. And this is okay, and that I think we need to do that. But as computer scientists, we should not be thinking in that way only. There is the things that humans can see and computers can do faster and maybe more reproducibly, which is like segmentation or delineation, these things that. The challenge there is to work them into the radiologist's routine. And then the things, what I call the things that you cannot see, and I think someone else said that, probably Paul said that, and these are the things that I'm primarily most excited about. Radiologists look at an MRI of a patient with schizophrenia, and they say, this is a normal MRI. A patient with TBI, this is a normal MRI. I face it all the time. You do the calculations and you find out that this part of the brain is 3 standard deviations below normal. It's not normal, and the person is devastated. They have a devastating disorder, or they cannot concentrate or sleep or think or whatever after trauma. So these are the things we cannot see. So it's not necessarily that radiologists are our customers right now. It's we should be thinking, and I keep saying that in the past 200 years, technology created legs and arms and ears and eyes. We created cranes that can lift much stronger than we can, and planes that can fly that we cannot. I think now we're creating brains. And I think we have to be thinking of the things that can be done in the future that humans absolutely cannot even dream of right now. And this is the future for the field. So while we try to work our way into the radiologist's clinical routine, I think at the same time we should be thinking long-term is that we're going to create the machines that will completely, enable things that we cannot think of. And of course, the radiologist or whatever clinician of the future will learn to control those cranes to lift heavy stuff rather than trying to lift them on their own. So I think this part of this thinking is not very deeply ingrained into a lot of people's work. I think we need to embrace that.
Towards the extended radiologist, then more like augmented intelligence, I guess.
Or next generation, next 10.
No, that's a very good point. And in fact, I think it's also the case that past a certain complexity. Looking at brains or an organ is something, but when you bring into the fold ideas from things like personalized medicine, that now you need to sequence people, and now you need to do some other lab tests, and now you need a number of things, then it becomes really beyond, it goes really beyond the remit of a single radiologist. Actually, you indeed have these multidisciplinary seminars of like, how do you integrate all these findings? A good example is the cancer board or tumor boards, where you have all these specialists coming along. And I think this is probably, I would say this is probably a model for the future, maybe also for brain pathologies. So like in this idea of like augmenting human intelligence and providing next generation tools that even clinicians are not aware that they need. Paul, what would you say in terms of combining all these data flows, not only images, but proteomics, genomics, and all these omics? How useful is it to date, this kind of combination? How easily is it to grasp for clinicians, and what do we need to do to go towards this, combining image with other modalities for better patient care?
Yeah, I totally know what you mean, Jonas. And I mean, one challenge is that, you know, as mathematicians, I mean, many of us were trained as mathematicians and engineers. We didn't necessarily learn any molecular biology or genomics in that field. I mean, just like AI is moving rapidly on. If you go to, as you know, the Alzheimer's meetings, they have these plasma assays that are fantastic. And often we learn about these where people say, oh, well, that's a lot better than imaging. It's faster, it's cheaper, more convenient, and things like that. So I think, Jonas, as you've said, I mean, part of the challenge for us is learning a reasonable amount of each of these fields so that we're in a reasonable position to then combine them and know what sorts of predictive models are good. And I can say just from my own experience with running imaging genetics projects, I mean, people tend to be either trained in genetics or in imaging. And so they might not know that with images, you can do anything other than, you know, measure the volumes of parts of the brain. And I mean, you can imagine what, CNNs could do with imaging genetics. I mean, the people in this room at the moment could probably, I mean, just to give you an example, nearly all imaging genomic studies that are published are mass univariate studies. I mean, this group is an exception, but nearly all of them just segment something and go ahead and troll the genome. You can imagine, you know, as these methods with RNNs, CNNs, kernel learning, I mean, you name it, get more popular, you could probably crack that puzzle with much greater power. I mean, even if you said, you know, can you relate DNA variants to imaging variation? I mean, there'd be no end. I bet in 5 years that's done completely differently. So I think to answer your question, the trick I think will be is, you know, for us all to learn enough of these other fields in an efficient way to come up with the most sensible approaches to them. And I have to tell you, I find it really difficult. I mean, one of the review papers on GANs that I read the other day said that there's one paper per hour published on GANs and imaging, one paper per hour. I mean, that's going to be rather a lot of papers to read. So in much the same way, I mean, I think in genetics and omics, if a handful of our folks here can go and listen to some of those symposia as well, it takes time. I mean, not all of us have enough time to do this. Then, I think, Jonas, you mentioned this earlier, building the bridges between these different fields and the types of data and peculiarities of analyzing the data, you know, we can sort of educate a little bit each other with, things that make sense. But I don't know if you would agree. I find it really hard. I mean, we're supposed to know this stuff, but it's just really, really difficult to stay on top of it. So, I mean, symposia like this one and workshops like this one seem like they have a very nice role bridging, you know, the far end of mathematics to radiology to other kind of clinical questions.
Absolutely. So maybe let's have a sidebar on this one. I think you've hit on a very critical thing. It's basically impossible, I would argue, to stay on top of, let alone one field in machine learning. So maybe this is one thing I would like. Actually, I'm actually this is for my own benefit. Like, how do you keep up with all the new things? Like, we talked about workshops. So this is definitely one. It's quicker to attend one-day workshop than read, you know, all the papers. So Emma, how do you stay on top of things?
Twitter, basically. I think I've found it very valuable since I joined Twitter. The most relevant and the most interesting papers just seem to filter through the noise because they're getting shared by everybody. And in that way, actually, I've kind of diversified my interests quite a lot just through doing that.
Yeah. So Twitter, and then is there like specific workshops that you make a point of attending, or do you have, like, how do you deal with, let's say you have now graduate students, like how do they come into that? How do you filter everything?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, attending conferences and workshops have not been so easy because I've got 2 small children. So I've had to use Twitter a lot to network and develop small groups through that, I think, mostly. Which has been quite useful. But I mean, I'm hoping to be able to get involved with more conferences and workshops going forward, especially if they're in person. I don't have screaming children down below.
Emma, can I interject here? Maybe I'll challenge you a little bit on that Twitter comment. So, I mean, to generate maybe some discussion around this, I'm kind of an old school person, although I am on Twitter and I have found it very useful, as you said. But I mean, there is a risk that whatever surfaces on Twitter is not necessarily the best or the only work. It's not peer, I mean, it's not reviewed or filtered by anything. So how do you deal with that? Just what services out, and
But to be fair, I guess
people tweet a lot doesn't mean that it's a good piece of work, right?
No, I guess to be fair, you take more notice if they're tweeting about their NeurIPS papers or the MICI papers. I mean, what we try to do in our group as well is run instead of group reading groups, group tutorials where we have people lead on a topic and then they try and teach others about it. So they have to do a certain literature review. So that also helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Adrian, how do you keep on top of everything that's happening in all the fields you're interested in?
I don't. I do the usual opening too many tabs until it all crashes. But I do agree on that. I use Twitter a lot. I also agree with Christos that the filtering is questionable, at least to me, like the papers that make it to me, but it's a way. And the truth is I can't read a paper an hour, if they're coming out at an hour. So somehow they have to make it to me, and I'm sure it's not gonna be perfect, but if it's gone through review and it's gone through some of my channels on Twitter, it's probably a decent predictor. But I think the other angle is the students get really excited about something, and that's how it percolates to me. And if I don't read those, then I fall behind the group. So I need to stay on top of whatever they care about. So I think it's a mix, but I would say it needs a lot of improvement. I'm not sure. I'm eager to hear what everyone else says.
Collaborating, filtering through graduate students sounds also like a good algorithm. So what about you, Paul? How do you stay?
I love these answers. I agree, Emma, with your answer. I mean, the problem to me is, I mean, all of us have a finite amount of time, which seems to be shrinking. And we have to understand the foundational mathematics. And so I have some books I really like. There's one by David Foster on generative deep learning to paint, write music. And I love that book, really, really good. And over Christmas, when I thought, I don't understand this field anymore, it's moved on. I mean, I just lost. Getting a book like that was really nice. And others here might have other recommendations of books. The reason I kind of like books is that they're a little bit more systematizing. And so I mean, rather than a paper that has to summarize in a very short amount of time what everyone else is doing, I mean, there's a little bit more, I mean, you know this as educators as well. I mean, there's a little bit more motivation and background there. But then, I mean, for the immediate updates, I think, Emma, like you said, I mean, looking at Twitter, I mean, asking your colleagues what conferences they've been to. And I mean, even this collaborative network of folks that you might know that might deal more with algorithmic fairness or the mathematics or federated learning. I mean, there was a conference on federated learning, and there's actually a MICI workshop on it as well. I love that, but what happens if you only have an hour to learn about that? I mean, do you watch the first couple of talks, or do you ask your friends what was good, and then do you go and look at those? So maybe collectively we can help each other find resources and learning techniques that make this more efficient, because I always feel the same way. It's as if the whole history of literature was discovered yesterday and we're suddenly behind and have to read it all. And maybe there's some guides, like tour guides in a foreign country that could guide us through this sort of labyrinth of literature that we don't have time to read. So anyway, that wasn't a good answer. It's sort of a restatement of the problem. So
I just want to make a comment responding to that. I think another answer to books, but shorter, is if people made efforts to write really good tutorials on, the last 5 years of GANs or whatever. I have found tutorial sessions, very well-designed tutorial sessions, to be unbelievably good and informative in an hour or in 3 hours or something like that. But it's a lot of work and we don't encourage it in the community. So I think that would be fantastic if we strive for that, or if maybe we should do this with Melba, or some journal runs a sort of, I don't know, tutorial, issue or something.
I agree. Well-written books and tutorials are critical, and I think in the end, pretty much have time only mainly for those, you know, as Paul and everybody else said. You know, there's one more thing I would like to add that is kind of, it's not an immediate action item. It's a social issue that I think that we publish too much, all of us. You know, there's an inflation of publications. So if we condense things down to, you know, a much smaller number, more substantial publications, it will be much easier for others to go through our own work and say, okay, this is this line of work that is all summarized here. I'll spend a few hours to read this paper, but then I will know it all. I don't have to sort through 10 or 20 different papers. And the system doesn't really encourage this.
Yeah, maybe just one super fast point. I really like the videos, and actually this is a good example. So just preparing for the talk I gave, I was reading a lot of papers, and I'm going to admit I don't understand them straight away. You have to stop and then go and look something up, and it takes a while. But I noticed that this trend, I mean, at McKay and Middle and the other meetings, of having the folks present a short 10-minute video. Often, I don't know why this is, if there's a human being there that is understanding it and explaining it. I mean, at least to me, that's often a lot better than reading the paper, because I can confuse myself with a paper. So maybe, I mean, it's a byproduct of COVID. I mean, the fact that we're doing a lot more video and online meetings and presentations, I mean, to me, that's been tremendously helpful, because you remember we used to get the MICI proceedings, the paper proceedings, put it on the table. And I would get stuck and actually, quite honestly, demoralized. I mean, if you sort of didn't understand a cool paper, you think, oh, you know, my brain doesn't work anymore. But I do find these online things with a person explaining things really, really helpful. And MIDL and other meetings, I mean, you can go to their YouTube channel later on and you'll look up, you know, nice explanations of papers, and you know, makes it a little easier for us to learn quickly.
Great point. So yeah, Twitter, short graduate students, more substantial papers and videos seem to be the answer for all of this. I'm very sorry, that's all the time we have for this panel discussion. I wish we could go on. It's been a fantastic pleasure talking to you. Adrian, Christos, Paul, and Emma, thank you very much for your time. It's been appreciated by everybody, I believe. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jonas.